2 weeks ago, I made a video about the assassination of Haitian President Jovenel Moïse, who was gunned down in his home in Port-au-Prince over a month ago. I also looked at the entire history of Haiti, going from the earliest Taino inhabitants all the way through to the modern day and the various political crises that have afflicted the island nation. And part of this history was the French colonization efforts and the subsequent revolt that was done by the slaves there, and which resulted in the creation of the first Black Republic in the Caribbean. As part of this history, I mentioned the role that Polish soldiers played in both the quelling and the establishment of this free state in Haiti. And I asked, would you like to see a video on this? And many of you, and thank you very much for doing so, got in touch and said, yes, we would like to see this video. And so today I'm going to be looking at what was the role of the Poles in the Haitian Revolution and who are the Polish Haitians. I'd recommend, if you haven't yet seen that video on the history of Haiti, to go and watch it, because I go and talk about the entire history of Haiti there, whereas today I'm going to be jumping in somewhat in the middle. However, what will also be important for today is to look at a little bit of Polish history, which is what I'm going to do now, because Poland, as part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, was a powerhouse in Central and Eastern Europe for much of the Middle Ages and into the early modern period as well. However, going into the 18th century, they were in a state of decline at the hands of their powerful neighbours. In 1764, the elected prince was Stanisław August Poniatowski, and he had been the lover of Yekaterina, who is more famously known in English at least as Catherine the Great of Russia. And as such, it was seen that Poland from this period on was a bit of a puppet state to Russia in many regards. This rubbed a lot of Poles the wrong way, and in 1768 there was in fact a confederation of noblemen at the town of Bar who formed the Bar Confederacy and fought against the Russian-backed Polish government and Russian influence there. Although when they lost, again with the help of Russian soldiers fighting for August's government, the Russian influence grew only stronger in Poland. In the same year of 1768, Russia once again went to war with the Ottoman Empire in the Russo-Turkish War of that same year, and was very successful in capturing territory from the Ottomans, something which alarmed the Austrians, who traditionally had wanted to keep the balance of power between the Ottomans and the Russians, as well as other powers in the region. This was also something that France was keen to exploit, because France was on friendly terms for once in its existence with Russia, but also with neighbouring Prussia, who also wanted to keep a sort of balance of power and didn't want Russia to get too powerful. And so France brought together the nations of Prussia, Russia and Austria in a deal, and in 1772, instead of fighting among themselves, instead they decided to partition part of Poland, in so doing annexing different border regions to their territory. In 1790, Poland tried to regain some of its stature and was forced into a somewhat unhappy allegiance with the Prussians, who had traditionally been Poland's enemies. This didn't sit very well with the Russians, who had also been enemies of the Prussians and had wanted to take more of Poland for its own. And so in 1792, the Russians invaded Poland and defeated the Polish armies in battle. The Poles put up a stout resistance, fighting the Russians all the way. However, the king crumbled and eventually decided to join with the Russians in the Targowice Confederation rather than maintaining an alliance with Prussia. Now, there were already Russian soldiers inside Poland after having fought the Polish army to force them to join their side. However, Prussia smelt blood in the water, and having recently lost the Battle of Valmy against the French, decided to compensate itself by invading Poland and taking yet more territory. And Russia decided to do the same. And they say history doesn't repeat itself. Needless to say, the Poles were getting a bit fed up of this by now, and in 1794 the Kościuszko Uprising occurred, and they had some initial successes fighting against the occupying forces of both Prussia and of Russia. It was led and named after Tadeusz Kościuszko, who had fought alongside the American patriots in the American Revolution and was an experienced commander. However, the enemy armies would prove too strong, and they were ultimately defeated, and this defeat led to, in 1795, the third partition of Poland, which would see Poland disappear from the European map for around a century before re-emerging at the end of the First World War. Now, things hadn't been standing still in the rest of Europe at this point, and the French monarchy that had, of course, originally intervened and suggested the idea of partitioning Poland had been toppled and replaced with the French Republic. And by 1795, the three nations responsible for the partition of Poland found themselves all at war with this new French Republic. And of course, the main villain that they saw in France at the time was a certain small individual called Napoleon Bonaparte. Before getting into that, a quick word from today's video sponsor, which is Magellan TV. Magellan TV is a paid-for video streaming service with thousands of different documentaries that you can gain access to with a small monthly fee. They cover many different topics like science, nature, and history. I'd like to recommend one in particular today, which is called Napoleon, from a series of warriors, and it's by the BBC, so it has a lot of famous British actors in it. For example, Rob Brydon appears in this one, and in another one, you've got the fella who plays the Hound in Game of Thrones. But the content is also very good, and that's why I thought this would be a perfect fit for today's video, because of course Napoleon plays a central role in why the Poles actually ended up on Haiti in the first place. So it's a really great watch, and you can have access to this and many other documentaries on similar topics by going to Magellan TV. There's even a special offer for viewers of this channel. You can either go to the description or simply type try.magellantv.com/historywithhilbert for a free month of premium membership. It's really worth checking out, so do check it out because that does help out the channel as well, and you can get access to all these great documentaries. But anyway, let's dive into it. In 1797, sensing a chance at revenge, many Polish people joined the Legiony Polskie we Włoszech, some of which were led by Jan Henryk Dąbrowski, who is potentially the most famous commander and who fought through Napoleon's campaigns in Italy, which is where the name comes from, the Polish legions in Italy, and also in his German campaigns against those responsible for the partitions of Poland. However, in 1801, many of the Poles in these legions who had fought incredibly hard in Napoleon's service were disheartened at the Treaty of Lunéville because this had no mention of Poland and the recreation of a Polish state, which was the impetus for many of the Poles to serve under Napoleon. This only got worse the following year in 1802, when many of the Polish legions were shipped out to Haiti, of course very far away from Poland and not really connected to re-establishing an independent Polish kingdom, which had been their aim in the first place, or rather a republic, because they were fighting for Napoleon. And also because many of the crack French troops had been spared from going to the Caribbean, so Napoleon thought he would simply use his lesser Polish soldiers to go and fight there, as well as some Swiss and German mercenaries. The casualty rates were absolutely atrocious for the Poles. Of around 5,280 that went, only 1,280 would actually survive both the journey and the fighting on Haiti. Many of those who died of tropical diseases such as yellow fever being a big killer, as well as of course in combat against the Haitian rebels themselves. And it's at this juncture that the famous story of the Poles defecting from the French army and joining with the Haitian rebels that this occurs. There is some debate as to how many of the Poles actually switched sides, and there are varying accounts. Some scholars have suggested that in fact it was probably only a few hundred, but considering the fact that so many Poles died of disease and that it was a 1 in 5 chance of surviving, several hundred of that remaining 1,000 is quite a large number nonetheless. Furthermore, it's quite possible that Polish commanders returning to Europe after the completion of the Haitian campaign, which was unsuccessful for the French, downplayed the number of Poles who defected to the rebel side because of course they didn't want to besmirch the name of the Polish legions upon returning, as ultimately they wanted the French to grant them their independence. What's also interesting is that some of the Poles actually went and became pirates, such as Kazimierz Lux, who was a famous pirate and attacked American and other countries' shipping in the Caribbean before returning back to Poland, and he died in Warsaw in 1846. Why did the Poles switch sides? Well, some of the Poles might have done so from an honest conviction that slavery was wrong, and in fact they had been told that they would be sent to Saint-Domingue, the colony of the French on Haiti, to put down a prisoner rebellion. But when they got there, they realized that they were actually fighting to reinstate slavery, and some of them probably disagreed with this. Others might have drawn parallels between the plight of the Haitians, who wanted to create an independent nation against a much more powerful colonial power, with their own plight back home in Poland against the Russians, Austrians and Prussians, and for this region switched sides, whereas others perhaps saw the way that the wind was blowing and switched sides out of tactical allegiance, and therefore helped the creation of the Haitian state. What's interesting is that around 400 of the soldiers, presumably the ones that switched sides to the side of the Haitians during the conflict, stayed in Haiti at the conclusion of the Haitian Revolution against the French, and they were actually expressly spared from the massacre of whites, largely Frenchmen, who remained in Haiti following the campaign that was perpetrated by the victorious Haitian army. And in fact, in the Haitian Constitution of 1805, there are some very interesting articles. Now, article number 12 reads that no white man of whatever nation he may be shall put his foot on this territory with the title of master or proprietor, neither shall he in future acquire any property therein. However, in the following Article 13 we read, the preceding article cannot in the smallest degree affect white women who have been naturalized Haitians by government, nor does it extend to children already born, or that may be born of the said women. The Germans and Polanders naturalized by government are also comprised in the dispositions of the present article, meaning that Poles were able to inherit land and that they were being seen as part of the Noir class, which means black in French, and so they were seen as being natural Haitians along with the black slaves that had freed themselves. Although in Haitian Creole they're often referred to as Polone Nwa, which is the black Poles. And this ultimately is from a time when Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who was one of the first presidents of Haiti, pronounced that the Poles were the white Negroes of Europe, which at the time was seen as a great badge of honor, and as you may know, has spawned quite a few memes, which, say what you will about the memes, but it is the first time that I learned about Polish Haitians, and just goes to show the power of memes to inform history, although of course some of them may be of better taste than others. Many of the Polish soldiers who stayed behind eventually married Haitian and other women and created a small and often somewhat separate community from other Haitians, or in saying that retained a certain level of Polish identity among their new Haitian identity as well, many of them settling in the town of Kazal, which probably comes from the Polish Kaj Zalewski, this meaning the house of Zalewski, Zalewski being quite a common Polish surname. What's interesting is that there are several terms for this community that is descended from these Polish soldiers that intermarried into the local population. One of these is Maun Rouge, which is a Haitian Creole term for red skin, from rouge in French, if you will. And the reason why is not because they had particularly red skin, most likely, but rather because in Haiti there are different ways of expressing where one comes from in skin color. I already noted that noir or noir in Haitian Creole is a term that is often used for the indigenous people of Haiti, or how the government saw it as the black people of Haiti. But at the same time in Haiti there is an idea that one who has red skin is somewhat of a native, but also with white background, whereas white doesn't necessarily just refer to a color's skin, but also to someone being a foreigner, as someone who goes away from Haiti will become white, whereas one who is in Haiti for long enough will become black because of the sun. However, the Poles who were white didn't become quite fully black, but red, or at least this is one explanation behind the name. It's also possible that the Polish Haitians might have influenced one of the religions on Haiti, and this is the Vodou religion, which has its own special form in the island nation. And this is in the form of this particular image of the Madonna, which in Polish is called the Matka Boska Częstochowska, which is the Black Madonna of Częstochowa, which is a place in Poland. And as you can see, the depiction of both the Mother Mary and the baby Christ are shown as being black. And this actually led to it being adopted into this religion of Vodou, which is often seen as a syncretic religion between both the old African, often West African Yoruba religions and other traditions, and the new ideas of Catholicism that were often imposed on the slaves on the plantations by the French and others. And this led to the creation of some form of deity that is often referred to as Ezili Dantor. And this was, as shown in the Black Madonna, a kind of black female figure that is often associated with Christ. And actually in Kazal, this town where most of the descendants of the Polish Haitians live, there is a church with a dedication to a Black Madonna inside it, and you can still see it if you go there today. What's also interesting is that a hungan, which is a term for a kind of voodoo priest called Amon Fremon, actually went to Poland and featured in a film about Haitian voodoo in Poland at the time from 1980. Now, earlier in 1956, and as I mentioned in my video about Haitian history, François Devalier became the dictator of Haiti, and he's more commonly known as Papa Doc. That's his sort of nickname that has survived because he was a doctor, but he also reiterated the connection between Poland and the Haitians. However, because Kazal was a hotbed of communist activity in the 1950s, this didn't stop him from sending in 1969 his militia, the Tonton Makut, who carried out a massacre in the village. But luckily the Polish population bounced back and survived from this. And actually they had revenge in some small way against the regime of Papa Doc's son, Jean-Claude Devalier, who's often called Baby Doc, because the Pope at the time, John Paul II, was Polish, and he actually visited in 1983. He went to Haiti and gave a very famous speech there in which he somewhat erroneously, but the gist is right, refers to the history of the Polish legionnaires in Haiti, saying a certain episode quite dramatic which somehow connected the history of Haiti with the history of the Polish nation. 170 years ago, 3,000 Polish soldiers sent by the occupier to suppress the uprising of people fighting for their independence landed on this island. These soldiers, rather than fighting the legitimate aspirations for freedom, sympathized with the people of Haiti. About 300 of them survived. Their descendants undoubtedly contributed to the development of this country. They preserved and nurtured Catholic traditions. Among other things, they built many chapels of Our Lady of Częstochowa. Now, what's interesting is that this speech in other parts was quite critical of the regime of Devalier, and it's often said that this was the turning point when Haitian people started to rebel against the regime, and in 1986 the regime of Devalier was overthrown. The presidential connection that is often remarked upon between Poland and Haiti continued as the wife of René Préval, when she in 2000 visited the Polish capital of Warsaw, actually also noted on the joint history between them, and thereafter, citing her ancestors from Kazal, referred to herself as Gery Benoit Belnowski. Belnowski, of course, being a Polish surname that her grandfather still carried. Now, while the Polish language has disappeared from the Polish Haitian community in favor of Haitian Creole in the case of Kazal, there are several idioms and phrases that are still used by Polish Haitians, and I believe also some by Haitian Creole speakers at large, that refer to the old Polish community there. One of these is là-bas en Pologne, which means down there in Poland. Another is Maap fe Kraków, which is quite interesting because this means I do like in Krakow. Of course, Krakow or Kraków is a city in Poland, and it literally means to do something neatly. So there was a memory that Krakow was a proper city, a place where things are done neatly, and that has then gone into the idiom of the Polish community in Haiti. Finally, there is another one which is Chargé coup la Pologne, which has had several interpretations, but the most likely to me is charged like Poland, which literally means to be well prepared, and this probably refers back to the soldiers fighting on the side of the Haitians during the revolution. There is also a form of Polish folk dancing that is still done in these communities called polka, And finally, you will often see that the people there, and this isn't actually a Polish Haitian for copyright reasons, I'm not able to use any pictures, but you can go and Google those yourselves and you'll see what I mean, that the women there, and the girls especially, they still braid their hair in the Slavic style, as you will see in Poland. And what's also very interesting is that many of these people will have fairly light skin. Of course, they are several generations of intermarriage with the local population, so they're not as white as other people in Poland, but a lot of the time they also have light eyes, and some even have fair hair, which is incredibly interesting, and that goes back to this Polish community that settled down in various parts of Haiti. Now, this is the end of my video on the Poles in Haiti. I hope it's been somewhat interesting. I did do some digging and try and find some sources about various things. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to show any pictures of Kazal itself because of copyright reasons, but I would highly recommend going and checking those out for yourself so you can see what I'm going on about. It's an incredibly interesting topic, so I thank everyone for giving me the feedback on the previous video to let me know that you would indeed be interested in this kind of video. Now, I think I've covered Haiti a fair amount, so I think next week I'll be moving on to another kind of topic. But I'd definitely be interested in looking at more current events and history, as this seems to be something that draws a lot of people in and people seem to quite enjoy, especially about places that aren't often covered in history videos like Haiti. I would also like to say a huge thank you to all the patrons for continuing to support me and my endeavors on Patreon and allowing me to continue to make these YouTube videos. And a massive thank you to everyone else for watching, for liking, for commenting, and just being wonderful all the time, I hope. Anyway, this has been Hilbert, and this is the history, and I'm Hilbert, and I will see you next week.